Hello, my name is Michael Fromm and I'm chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to the third in our Israel 202 webinar series. JCPA and the Israel Policy Forum have collaborated to hold a four-part series on Israel to ensure the community relations network is updated and proficient on basic issues related to Israel's democratic system in order to better serve as nuanced advocates. Today's session is Palestinian politics in Israel and the territories. Professor Khalil Shakaki will break down the most pressing issues in Palestinian politics today. Khalil Shakaki is professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. Since 2005, he's been a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Since 1993, Dr. Shikaki has conducted more than 200 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And since 2000, dozens of joint polls among Palestinians and Israelis. Dr. Shikaki's research has focused on the peace process, Palestinian state building, public opinion, transition to democracy, and the impact of domestic Palestinian politics on the peace process. He is the co-author of the annual report of the Arab Democracy Index and a member of the steering committee of the Arab Barometer, two initiatives led by the Arab Reform Initiative. Our program today will be led by Margot Nykirk, the Policy and Communications Associate at Israel Policy Forum. Thank you for joining us. Margot?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the third Israel 202 video briefing, and this time it'll be about Palestinian politics. And I also want to thank JCPA for partnering with us on this initiative. But before we delve into things, I'd like to remind everyone that we'll be taking questions from the audience later in the Q&A section of the program. You can ask your questions at any point throughout the lecture by typing them into the question box at the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll be collecting your questions throughout the lecture and we'll delve into them towards the end. So today we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Khalil Shakaki. Thank you for joining us, and I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Margot. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. My intervention today is going to focus essentially on four issues. I will try to describe the basic trends that one can see in Palestinian politics today. This is about the domestic environment as well as Israeli-Palestinian relations. From that, I will then describe some of the risks that these trends create, risks for the Palestinian Authority and for Israeli-Palestinian relations. And thirdly, I will try to assess what might be the triggers that would transform these risks from hypothetical risks into real threats that would affect the stability of the Palestinian Authority, as well as Israeli-Palestinian relations. And finally, I'll say a few things about the resilience of the status quo, the resilience of the Palestinian Authority, and the resilience in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Why, despite the fact that things are going in clearly negative directions, we do not see an explosion within the Palestinian Authority, an implosion within the authority, and an explosion in Israeli-Palestinian relations. What makes the current situation so resilient? So let me start with the first question about the trends. Now, there is no doubt that in the last decade, these trends have been very negative, both in the domestic environment. The negative trends can be seen in the direction that the Palestinian Authority has been taking. The authority has essentially become more and more authoritarian. The steps that have been taken by the Palestinian leadership over the last 5 years in particular, but certainly earlier as well, have essentially removed any kind of accountability from the political system, has made the judiciary lacking in any independence, have essentially imposed a lot of constraints on civil society so that it is no longer pluralistic and has affected freedom of speech. All these things are negative things that have occurred within the political system and have been watched by the Palestinian public. The surveys that we have conducted have clearly indicated year after year that the public has reached the conclusion that the political system is becoming more and more authoritarian. And so that this is the judgment of the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public. One of the consequences of this is that we see more and more questioning of the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. We see, in fact, a great deal of skepticism about the credibility of the Palestinian leadership as well. Most people, if asked today about something that the Palestinian leadership has said, will say, and if we ask them whether the leadership will actually do the things that it says it wants to do, the answer by up to 80% is no. So the Palestinian leadership seems to lack, not only is missing the trust of the public, but is also lacking in credibility. This, on the domestic side of things, is related more to the political system and the direction it is taking. If we specifically look at how the public sees the various institutions, we will see a great deal of discontent about the direction, a great deal of discontent about corruption. More than 80%, 83% of the public will say the Palestinian Authority, the institutions of the Palestinian Authority are corrupt. If asked about free press, do we have free press? These are things today. 10 years ago, things would have been much, much better than they are today. If asked about free press today, in the last survey we conducted and asked about this, which was less than a year ago, only 17% said we have free press in Palestine. Overall, if we ask about the direction of the Palestinian Authority, are we going in the wrong or the right direction? Close to 85% say we are moving in the wrong direction. This is a fundamental trend that we currently see among the Palestinian public. It's a very worrying trend. In a minute, I'll describe some of the risks that this entails. But let me move to a second trend that we see, and this is also domestic. And it's about the relationship between the Palestinian Authority, which controls the West Bank today, and Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which is under Hamas, effectively under Hamas's control. Now, some of you might know that 12 years ago, Hamas violently took over Gaza, established its own government there. A different government was established in 2007 under Salam Fayyad in the West Bank. At that time, it was very clear that the public blamed Hamas for the bloodshed that led to this situation in June 2007. Hamas's popularity went down significantly as a result, but the public was still optimistic that some sort of reconciliation will lead to the reunification of the political system and the reunification of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The trend has in fact been, over the last 12 years, very negative. The two governments in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have essentially created their own institutions, their own regulations and laws, and as far as the public is concerned, today most of the public believes that this separation is permanent, or at least is a long term. These are things that we certainly did not see in the past. The trend, therefore, now is for people to think that the two sides are failing the Palestinians, they're failing to reunify, they're failing to reconcile. But most of the blame today unlike the situation just 5 years ago. The blame today is being placed on the Palestinian Authority and on President Abbas in the West Bank. The third trend that I want to describe has more to do with Israeli-Palestinian relations. There are various elements in this trend, in this issue that are very, very negative. The most important is the hardening of attitudes. The hardening of attitudes, that is, people are becoming less willing to compromise. We see this when we ask about the concept of the two-state solution. 10 years ago, 70% would have said yes. 25 years ago, 85% would have said yes. They support the concept of a two-state solution. In our most recent survey, which was conducted just 2 months ago, only 43% said they support the two-state solution. Over the last 2 years, we did not have a majority in favor of the concept of a two-state solution. The trend that we clearly see is that people are abandoning this concept, which has been central to Israeli-Palestinian relations since the Oslo process in 1993. It is not just about the concept, though. We have also been asking the Palestinians over the years about the various elements in any agreement along the lines of the two-state solution, an implementation package for the two-state solutions, things along the lines, for example, of the Clinton parameters of December 2000, or the elements that emerged in the negotiations between the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in 2008. In 2008, for example, these elements were put to the public. Our findings indicated at that time that a majority of the Palestinians, about 60%, this was also, by the way, a joint Israeli-Palestinian survey. This was a survey in 2008 that we conducted jointly with our colleagues at the Hebrew University at that time. 60% of the Palestinians supported that package. Today, we do not get more than 40% if we're lucky. In fact, the last time we asked about this, only 37% of the Palestinians supported these same compromises that they supported 11 years ago. So this is about the hardening of attitudes and regarding a peace agreement, regarding the terms of reference for any peace agreement, the rejection of the two-state solution is certainly an extremely important development because, as I said, this is basically the most important concept that had led to all the progress that has been made in the past in Israeli-Palestinian relations. We also see a few other things that are as important in terms of their consequences. The support for violence among Palestinians has been on the rise, particularly during the last 4 or 5 years. I'm comparing this with, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, support for violence was less than 30%, 30%. Today, support for violence can go all the way up to 50% or slightly less than 50%. So this is a significant change compared to where we were just a few years ago, and certainly 10 or 12 or 13 years ago, after the end of the Second Intifada. We see other negative developments, much greater interest on the Palestinian side in boycotts, in rejecting normalization of relations between Palestinians and Israelis. This had a very negative impact on the ability of Palestinians and Israelis to see each other, to meet, and to be able to exchange ideas and engage in any kind of dialogue. And the impact of this certainly is seen in the hardening of attitudes that I've described earlier. One last trend that I will talk about in this summary is what we see, the gap that is currently emerging between the youth, 18 to 29, and those who are 30 and above. This gap is a very serious one. It directly affects the Israeli-Palestinian question because it's the youth in particular who have been abandoning the two-state solution and the compromises entailed in it. Instead, those Palestinian youth are now favoring a different paradigm for resolving the conflict, one that is called the one-state solution. The one-state solution in the eyes of the Palestinian youth is one that is based on the creation of a single state in the area between the river and the sea that would include Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, with equal rights to Israeli Jews and Palestinians. This idea, 10 years ago, this idea would probably have given us about 20 to 25%. Today, more than a third of the Palestinians are in favor of this idea. Among the youth, the support for this idea could go up to 45%. This is the largest level of support for this idea among the Palestinian public. The 5 trends that I've described are important because they create risks. These risks, as I said earlier, affect both the Palestinian Authority as well as Israeli-Palestinian relations. In terms of the Palestinian Authority, obviously, the most important risk is that there would be an uprising against the Palestinian Authority. I'm not saying that this is likely to happen anytime soon. I'm just saying that if one is to look at these trends, one has to take into consideration that several things could happen that could lead to such an uprising against the Palestinian Authority. The separation, this is number 2. The separation between the West Bank and Gaza could indeed become permanent, and ruling out any possibility of reconciliation and reunification in the future. Again, things could happen, which I'll address in a minute, could happen that could create such a situation whereby this becomes a real threat and not just simply a risk. Thirdly, in Israeli-Palestinian relations, if this trend that we currently see continues, obviously we will see the demise of the two-state solution as a concept preferred by the Palestinians, and it will certainly be replaced by another one that, as I said, has been gaining in strength over the years, and that is the one-state solution. Certainly what the US administration had just done on Monday is also a contribution in this direction, creating conditions that make the two-state solution lacking in feasibility, certainly contribute to the trend that we currently see in support for the one-state solution. One has also to take into, although again, I'm not saying this is likely to happen anytime soon, but I think this is a risk that one must consider, and that the current support for violence could ultimately lead to the supply of violence. The demand for violence could lead, therefore, to an increased level of supply for violence from various groups, individuals and groups, and so we could see an eruption in Israeli-Palestinian relations that is violent, and certainly this is not something that one should take lightly. Finally, I would say, if some of the things that I am talking about, some of these risks are to really become threats, they will also generate a new risk, and that is the risk entailed in a collapse of the Palestinian Authority. And the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, again, is not something that is about to happen, and none of the things I've mentioned in this discussion about risks are things that I'm saying they are likely to happen. I'm certainly not saying that. All I'm saying is these 5 things, 5 risks that I've just described, are things that one must take into consideration given the trends that we currently see. So let me turn to the third issue that I wanted to address, which is the triggers or the tipping points. When would we know, or what would it take for these risks to become real threats? What would happen? What should we be looking for? Things that, if and when they start to happen, we should begin to worry. Well, I think one of the things that one should, again, this is based on the surveys that we conduct among the Palestinians. The first item is economic. If economic conditions deteriorate, and given what we currently see in terms of how the public views economic conditions, this is already a serious possibility. When asked about to define the basic challenges facing the Palestinians today, economics was number 1. It came up as the top most important challenge facing Palestinians. When asked to assess conditions today, economic conditions today, less than a quarter of the public said economic conditions are good or very good. 76% said things are bad or very bad. When we asked people, and by the way, if the question was addressed to the youth, the percentage of dissatisfaction with the current economic conditions is even much higher. This is due to the fact that the unemployment rate among Palestinian youth today stands at almost 50%, 48% to be precise. That's a huge level of unemployment among a particular age group that could very well engage in all kinds of things that I've talked about as risks a minute ago. The last thing about the economics I want to say is about the future, optimism about the future. Will things be better in the future with regard to this economic issue? The answer by 80% of the public is no, things will be worse. Only 20% of the public believes that economic conditions will improve. So overall, this is indeed a very serious, this is essentially a ticking bomb. The inability of the Palestinian Authority, imagine a condition similar to what's happening in Iran right now. They raise the prices of fuel. Well, if the Palestinian Authority is to do something like this right here, things will be much worse than we currently see in Iran regarding fuel prices. If unemployment among the youth is to continue to rise, we could also see similar things. If the Palestinian, some of you might know that over the last 10 months, since February until just 2 months ago, the Palestinian Authority was not able to pay the full salary of the Palestinian Palestinian public sector. This is due to the fact that the Palestinian Authority refused to accept the clearance revenues from the Israeli side. The Palestinian Authority has stopped this practice and agreed to take the revenues about 2 months ago. But if this is to happen again, whether it is a deliberate decision or a miscalculation on the part of the Palestinian Authority or a miscalculation on the part of the Israeli side, the consequences again could be very, very serious in terms of that, the internal implosion, as well as the potential for conflict on the Israeli-Palestinian side of things. The second, so I focus a lot on the economic side of things. The second issue that I think would be a trigger is a succession crisis. If Abbas is no longer with us, given the current institutional setup, the institutional design of the Palestinian Authority and how one elect a new president and a temporary president and so on. This institutional design does not exist today. It does not exist because of measures that the Palestinian president had done in response to measures that Hamas have taken and so on. So it is not a simple matter of assigning somebody to be an interim president. Our basic law says it should be the speaker, but we do not have a parliament to have a speaker, and therefore it is not clear what happens if there is no president. And secondly, holding elections, something I will come back to in a minute, but at this point we still don't know whether elections are a feasible option for Palestinians either today or in the future. So the succession question is a very serious one because of the consequences, not only in terms of this institutional design, by the way, but also because of how Fatah, that controls the West Bank, would select the successor. The nature of the conflict and the competition that is likely to ensue in the absence of an institutional design that clarifies how this process should take place. A serious problem that the Palestinian Authority, by the way, is currently trying to address by talking about the possibility of elections. As I said, I'll talk more about the elections in a minute. A third tipping point could be something that the Israeli government might do. Annexation of Palestinian territories could be extremely damaging to the current Israeli-Palestinian relations. This would be a major blow to the status quo in terms of how the current relations are organized, not only in terms of the security relationship between the two security establishments. The security sector coordination that is currently underway could easily be a victim of such a development. But more importantly, this could have an impact, a significant impact on radicalizing Fatah. Fatah is the backbone of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and if Israel goes in this direction, I think it almost it is certainly likely that there would be consequences leading to a significant radicalization within Fatah in terms of how relations with the Israeli side should be organized. There are other likely tipping points that are not Israeli or Palestinian. They could certainly in part be initiated or happen because of Palestinian or Israeli decisions. A war in Gaza is one of those, not a simple clash, but a fundamental war that lasts for a long period of time and lead to a significant change in the situation in Gaza, or the opposite, if the Israeli government and Hamas are to reach a long-term arrangement. The likely reaction in the West Bank is likely to be extremely negative. This will certainly lead to the permanent separation between the West Bank and Gaza. But given the steps that the Palestinian Authority might take, the situation in Gaza might worsen dramatically as a result, and the situation in the West Bank might also worsen significantly as a result. A regional war could also be a tipping point, an Israel-Iran war, for example, or a regional war in which the Saudis and the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans are involved. The consequences of this war are obviously not clear at this point, but the risks involved in such a war could be very dramatic for Israeli-Palestinian relations. Similarly, a regime change in Jordan, a destabilization of Jordan could have immediate, significant impact on not only in Jordan, but also in the West Bank. And a regime change in Egypt could have significant impact on Gaza and on Hamas in Gaza. Okay, so I've described the trends and the risks and the tipping points. I want now to move to my fourth area, and that is why the current status quo is resilient. Why, despite the trends, the risks at this point are not likely or are not, in fact, becoming real threats. And these are the reasons why. These are the elements of resilience in the status quo, in the current situation in Israeli-Palestinian relations. First, perhaps, and most importantly, in terms of the stability of the Palestinian Authority and the continued existence of the Palestinian Authority, it's in part because the Palestinian public still wants the Palestinian Authority, despite all the complaints about authoritarianism, corruption within the Palestinian Authority, concerns about the unification of the West Bank. Despite all of that, Palestinians still say that we should maintain the Palestinian Authority. This societal trust in the Palestinian Authority, despite all its problems, is a significant element of resilience that keeps the public interested in maintaining the stability of the Palestinian Authority. This is supported by the fact that the elite in the West Bank, this is a secular nationalist elite from Fatah, which is the largest political faction today in Palestinian politics. This elite is a cohesive elite, despite the problems at the top, if Abbas is no longer here. But this elite has a great deal of interest in maintaining its control over the Palestinian Authority. It is an interest in preserving the Palestinian Authority, preventing its destabilization, certainly preventing its collapse. So this social trust within the elite and the interest of the elite in maintaining the Palestinian Authority is a very positive element that gives resilience to the status quo. The second element of resilience is in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Again, despite all the existing problems that we have seen in the past in Israeli-Palestinian relations, Palestinians and Israeli security sectors have continued to maintain a high level of coordination and cooperation on all matters related to security. As I said earlier, this is not guaranteed in the future if certain things are to happen. But under the status quo, this level of Israeli-Palestinian cooperation on matters of security as well as civil matters in their relationship is a strong motivation for the two sides to prevent things from escalating and to keep things under control. They provide channels of communication. They provide room for each side to explain what it is doing and its interest in maintaining this situation. It doesn't guarantee that there will be no miscalculation. We saw this miscalculation happening, obviously, early this year in February, when the Palestinians wanted to deter the Israelis from deducting a certain amount of money from the clearance revenues, and the Israelis were going to elections, and we saw how the Palestinians miscalculated, and ultimately the Israelis called Abbas's bluff, and as a result, the Palestinian Authority went into significant economic constraints without the correction that was made 2 months ago This economic constraints, as I said earlier, could have been disastrous for the PA. So the fact that the channels of communication are there, the institutional design in Israeli-Palestinian relations, there are a lot of attacks on Oslo by both sides. Nonetheless, both sides still maintain their commitments to that institutional design. It's the only thing that is out there that helps them define this relationship. If the Israelis, as I said earlier, annex certain parts, this would be a major violation of this. And it could very well significantly destabilize this institutional design. I would say that I described the hardening of attitudes among Palestinians earlier, but I would say, based on the research that we have done jointly with Israeli colleagues, this time at Tel Aviv University, the hardening of attitudes that we saw, the rejection of the two-state solution, the rejection of compromise entailed in an implementation package of a two-state solution, is reversible. We have found that if we offer incentives to Palestinians or Israeli Jews, by the way, we can significantly restore the level of support for compromise and for the two-state solution. As I said earlier, about 40%, slightly more for the concept, slightly less for the package of implementation, continue to support this paradigm. But with the right incentives, we have found that we can increase this level of support to 60 or 70%, restoring it to where it was 10 years ago. And that is very encouraging, that the change, the hardening of attitudes that I described earlier in the trend is not driven by ideology, it's not driven by religion. In fact, religiosity among Palestinians have declined. Over the last 10 years, the level of religiosity, particularly among the youth, have declined considerably. Today, only 38% in our last survey, 38% of the Palestinians say they are religious. Among the youth, only 26% say they are religious. This is a significant decline from where we were 10 years ago. So it's not ideology that has driven the hardening of attitudes. It's more threat perception, the perception that the two-state solution is no longer feasible. So the trend is negative, but the fact that it is driven by these forces rather than by ideology or religion is a positive thing. And our findings indicate that one can restore the level of support to where it was before. I will stop here. I think I've taken more time than I wanted to. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Shikaki, for a very informative introduction. I'd just like to remind our audience that you can send your questions into the question box. I'll start off with one and encourage you to keep asking more questions. But Dr. Shikaki, I just wanted to touch upon something you had said earlier, that in a survey you had conducted, 43% of the Palestinians who had answered the survey supported a two-state solution. What has caused this trend of abandoning the two-state solution, and what can be done to reverse it?
Essentially, three things. I alluded to them a minute ago. One, the most important, is the question of feasibility. 10 years ago, if we asked the Palestinians, do you think a two-state solution remains feasible today? Or if we said, would a Palestinian state be created, say, in the next 5 years? The response would have been a lot more positive than we see today. Today, approximately 70 to 75% say there will not be a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel, even in the next 5 to 10 years. When we ask, is the two-state solution feasible today? 2/3 say no, it is not feasible anymore because of settlement expansion. Israeli settlements have created a situation in which the Palestinian public essentially says, you cannot separate between the two peoples anymore. The prevailing perception is that the current situation is one that is more or less a one-state reality, and that what the Israeli government is currently doing in terms of settlement construction is leading to more and more consolidation of this one-state reality. And this is a major drive why people are abandoning the two-state solution, but it's not the only thing. We also saw an increased level of threat perception. People feel Israel poses a significant existential threat. A large percentage of Palestinians, actually a majority, in the last survey, 55%, said what the state of Israel wants is to take away Palestinian land and expel the population. Another 25% said what Israel wants is to take away the land and deny the Palestinians their civil rights. Now, that's 80% of the public. 10 years ago, 45%, maybe even 50% would have said that. Today, it's 80%. That's another driver. The higher the threat perceived, the lower the level of support for the two-state solution. And thirdly is the question of trust. Palestinians trust Israeli Jews much less today than they did 10 years ago. The more settlements Israel builds, the more questioning the Palestinians feel regarding the intentions of the state of Israel. If Israel wants peace, if it wants a two-state solution, why is Israel building right in the middle of the future Palestinian state? When we ask Palestinians, why do you not trust Israeli Jews? The answer is because they say something and do the exact opposite. These have been the basic drivers for this hardening of attitudes regarding the decline in support for the concept of a two-state solution.
Okay. And we have a question coming in from one of our audience members. He says that you talk a lot about trends and risks, and he was wondering if the trends and risks are the same in intensity in the West Bank and in Gaza, or do the residents of the two areas have different views of the political environment and possibilities for peace?
Yes, these are two different environments. In the West Bank, Palestinians, for example, see settlements every day. So the impact of settlements on West Bankers is dramatic. In Gaza, they don't see settlements anymore. There are no settlers in Gaza. So we do not see the impact of settlements, which is extremely negative, as I said. And so despite the fact that Gaza remains under Hamas's control today, the level of support, the overall level of support for compromise in Gaza is higher than the level of support for compromise in the West Bank. So this is one major difference with regard to between the West Bank and Gaza. There's a second major difference, which is the exact opposite of what I just said. Because of the way the Israelis pulled out from Gaza in 2005, unilateral withdrawal, and a decision that was taken during the Second Intifada, Gazans strongly believe that the only reason Israel pulled out from Gaza is due to the violence from Gaza. So the Israeli withdrawal is perceived as the Israeli army running under fire. So Gaza believes strongly that violence pays. This is certainly not the case in the West Bank. The level of support for violence, therefore, the support for armed struggle as the means to end the Israeli occupation is way much higher in Gaza than it is in the West Bank.
And on the topic between differences between residents of Gaza and the West Bank, I want to go more into their differences of the political institutions in place there. We have an audience member who was wondering why do you believe that negotiations between the PA and Hamas have failed? And yeah, if you could just go more into that.
Well, if we're asking about the perception of the public regarding the authorities in West Bank and Gaza, how the two societies, the Gazans versus West Bankers, see their authorities, then both are extremely critical of their authorities. There's a great deal of discontent, particularly among the youth, in both the West Bank against the Palestinian Authority and Abbas and Fatah, and in Gaza against Hamas. In all the issues about authoritarianism, freedom of speech, independence of the judiciary, ability of civil society to be independent and pluralistic, freedom of the press. The complaints in the West Bank are the same in Gaza. At times, it's higher, the level of complaints and discontent higher in Gaza. Here, we're talking about Hamas's authority, obviously, and sometimes it's higher in the West Bank. It depends on what's happening in that day. With regard to the question about why reconciliation has been failing, it's a good question, and there is no consensus as to why this is happening. But I recently wrote a policy paper on this issue, and my argument is that Fatah and Hamas act like two political parties who seek to maintain their party interests. This manifests itself in the fact that Hamas refuses to disarm its militia in Gaza. Hamas wants to keep Al-Qassam brigades, which basically is an army, but the Palestinian Authority under Fatah demands that Hamas disarms. Hamas is certainly not going to disarm, because that army that Hamas has is its insurance policy against both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And it certainly is not going to disarm under any circumstance. And for Fatah, the question is, why is Fatah insisting on disarming Hamas? It's a very good question, and obviously, because it wants to, it knows that it would not have any real control over Gaza if Hamas continues to have this kind of army, and it would have to operate under the shadow of such an army now. Most of the Palestinian public supports the view that we should postpone this issue. We shouldn't resolve this issue, or that this issue should not be a precondition for reunification and reconciliation. That perhaps after elections, whoever wins the elections can then begin to address this matter. I think to a large extent, this has been the primary factor. We have recently seen a trend emerging in terms of demand for elections. If we do go to elections, and certainly Hamas has made significant concessions recently that were not expected from Hamas to facilitate the holding of elections. This could be a window that might allow the reunification. This is certainly one of the things that could have a very positive impact on the current situation in Israeli-Palestinian in Palestinian relations, the domestic relations within the PA, but also in terms of Israeli-Palestinian relations and the conflict over Gaza.
So you just mentioned elections, and so I quickly want to transition into Abbas's leadership. He's been in his position for a very long time. I believe the last election was 2005, if I'm not wrong.
For the president, yes.
Yeah, for president. And he's 83 years old. He's not in such great health condition.
In a month and a half, he will be 85.
Oh, wow. Okay. Apologies. Math was not my forte. But so he'll be 85 soon. Who's going to, like, who has to take over? Someone has to eventually take over. Who can that be? And what do we need to expect for a future Palestinian leader in order to resolve these issues, in order to revitalize peace talks, in order to address these economic concerns? What is expected in the next Palestinian leader?
You're right. We didn't have presidential elections since 2005, and we did not have parliamentary elections since 2006. We are now in a process of discussion that is currently going on to hold elections. two factors have in the past prevented elections from taking place. One, Hamas's control over Gaza and the inability of the two sides to reconcile. This was a condition for holding elections. Now the two sides have abandoned this conditionality, and they are willing to go to elections without reconciliation taking place first. And the second is whether Israel will allow such elections in East Jerusalem. We had two elections, parliamentary elections before, and two presidential elections before, in which the Israelis allowed elections to take place in East Jerusalem. Given the current relationship, given the fact that since 2009, a right-wing Israeli government has been in place. We never had elections at a time when a right-wing Israeli government was in place. So it is not clear. There are doubts about the willingness of the Israelis to allow elections to take place in East Jerusalem. The question will be whether the Palestinians will find another way for East Jerusalemites to participate in such elections. Hopefully they will be able to find one, and hopefully they will be able to go to elections. Because in answer to your question about succession and what happens after Abbas, the answer is we don't know. The basic law, the Palestinian parliament, the Palestinian constitution says the Speaker of the House becomes, the Speaker of the Parliament becomes the interim president for 60 days, during which preparations should be made for elections. But it's, as I said, if we are failing to hold elections, how are we going to hold elections under conditions of extreme instability and destabilization conditions that could emerge as a result of the passing of Abbas? So we don't really know at this time. Hopefully, if we do go to elections soon, it will also be for a president, and it is not at this point clear whether Abbas will nominate himself. He, in the past, has said he will not nominate himself. There are voices within Fatah, among the senior leadership of Fatah. These are younger people who are in their 50s and 60s, who feel that if Abbas runs again, they will have no chance in the future of having to compete in elections like these. And so they want him to step down. They want him to not to compete in the upcoming elections. There are other people, of course, who within Fatah who also want him to run. It is not clear that he is going to run. If elections are held today, they will be only for a parliament. And I think the reason that Abbas, and this is Abbas's choice, he is the one who wants parliamentary elections to go first, to be followed later by presidential elections, he says. But I think he wants to hold parliamentary elections now and see the results. Based on the results, make up his mind whether there will be any future presidential elections at all, and if any, whether he himself would run in these elections.
So we'll take two more questions. I want to quickly switch over to the topic of U.S.-Palestinian relations, as it's been really at the forefront of the news cycle this week.
Yes.
There's been a lot of bumps in the relationship over the past year and a half or so, starting with the PLO office being ordered to close in DC, with the cuts of aid towards the PA and towards UNRWA. And then now on Monday, the Trump administration announced its softening of positions on settlements, saying that they're not illegal under international law. What does this mean both in terms of the U.S.-Palestinian relationship? What kind of setbacks are being put in place because of all of this? And how does this affect Israeli-Palestinian cooperation on the ground?
Well, for American-Palestinian relations, I think this is certainly a huge setback. I can't say there was any trust to begin with, so this is certainly going to deepen the existing distrust. I think as far as the Palestinians are concerned, the measures that have been taken by the current U.S. administration reflect an attitude that is aligned completely with the right-wing and the extreme right-wing elements in Israeli politics. This is the prevailing perception among the entire Palestinian public, and certainly among the Palestinian elite in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that the US administration has essentially aligned itself with the extremists in Israeli politics, and that these extremists are not interested in a two-state solution, that these extremists are essentially interested in the greater land of Israel, and that what the current administration is doing is to simply facilitate that the achieving of that goal of the greater land of Israel, that it would happen gradually. And ultimately, this is the demise of the two-state solution. And some Palestinians welcome that because they see this as a golden opportunity for a one-state solution. And certainly there is logic in that. What the administration is doing is to embolden right-wingers, extreme right-wingers, who certainly have no interest in any peace based on a two-state solution. And many of them, based on our joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys, would like to see a one-state outcome. To them, that one-state outcome is one in which the Palestinians are not given their full civil rights. Something obviously that the Palestinians will reject. The administration essentially, by doing all the measures that it had taken from back to December 17 with the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital for Israel, and all the other measures that have targeted the Palestinians, whether it's the Consul General office in East Jerusalem or the PLO office in Washington, to statements about refugees and about security and so on, to this last measure, it basically says to the Palestinians that the US is really irrelevant as far as a peace process is concerned. And this is really bad news. You asked about Israel, how this will impact on Israeli-Palestinian relations. This is really bad news for Israeli-Palestinian relations because, on the one hand, as I said earlier, it will embolden only the extremists and the right-wingers in Israeli politics, who will create further facts on the ground, consolidating this one-state reality, putting an end to a two-state solution, making the one-state solution as the only outcome for Palestinians, and thereby the trends that I described earlier will certainly be deepened by these measures, but it could also have even much more troubling outcomes. The ability of the Palestinian Authority, if the Israelis are indeed encouraged, we've seen the signs, the statement that was issued by Prime Minister Netanyahu regarding annexation. Not the earlier statement about the Jordan Valley, but the statement after the U.S. Statement on Monday. That is the direction things are heading then. But this will destabilize the existing situation. It is, as I said, resilient, but this will be a dramatic blow to such arrangements that are currently in place. And the impact of what was supposed to be a sign of support for Israel, I'm afraid Israel should not read it as a sign of support. This could be the beginning of an extremely negative dynamic in terms of both what happens on the ground and in the ability of Palestinians and Israelis, particularly in the two security sectors, to continue to work together.
So I want to try and end on a lighter note. We've been talking a lot about the difficulties facing between Israelis and Palestinians, but where has any progress been made? Can we be optimistic in one area? I'm particularly thinking maybe through security collaboration, intelligence sharing. Where can one be optimistic in all of this disarray?
Well, it's difficult to find optimistic things to end on, but you're right. Despite the worsening relationship between the two sides, and even during the crisis over the clearance funds or clearance revenues, the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli and Palestinian security services continued their security coordination and cooperation, which has been extremely successful. There is no doubt that this is the best indication of business as usual within the security sector, despite the total collapse of the political dimension in Israeli-Palestinian relations, and despite the very troubling relationship that is currently also taking place in the economic realm. The fact that despite the problem that emerged early this year, that eventually the two sides have managed to sit down, they haven't resolved the problem that started the whole thing about the transfer of the funds or the revenues. But they did manage to find ways to begin to unlock the problem. The fact that they have done that is also an indication that there are Palestinians and Israelis, both in the bureaucracy and in decision-making levels. We're not talking about the prime minister or the president. We're talking about people who deal with issues of money, economic questions, and so on, who have been successful in coming up with ideas to reduce the tension, facilitate some sort of dialogue. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, and again, this was certainly a significant problem that has been at least temporarily resolved, without this resolution, the economic conditions on the Palestinian side would have worsened dramatically, with significant impact on Israeli-Palestinian relations. These are certainly two good examples of the resilience of the status quo, the resilience of the operation that is currently going on between the two sides, despite all the problems that are around us and that are coming from Washington and could come from the direction of Gaza or anywhere else.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Shikaki, for a really interesting conversation and for your time. I know it's very late in Ramallah, so thank you very much. But to our audience, I would just like to let you know that we have one last lecture as part of the Israel 202 series coming up this month. It'll be with Tamara Kaufman-Wittes, and then just to note, it's been moved to November 27th at noon. Tamara is a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute, and she'll be giving us some insights on Israel's relations with the region. So thank you again, Dr. Shikaki, and thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you for one last conversation.